Two of the most influential bands in music history.
It was uniquely different than anything I had heard.
Being an innovator of new sounds, new rhythms, daring is important.
One incredible tale.
We were just doing whatever we wanted, whenever came into our heads, taking everything that we could take.
It was a bit like being a surfer who's just caught a wave. And you're like, whoa, well, this is fun. What's going to happen when the wave hits the beach, though?
This is Transmissions, the definitive story of Joy Division and New Order. Coming up on episode 4, it's back to the studio for some family bonding.
Brotherhood was a marked change in how Barney saw the group and how I saw the group.
But something's different this time, and tensions threaten to boil over.
You don't want to bruise another musician's ego, especially if you're in the same band with him. Hotel room, the van to the gig, the van to the airport, on the plane with him. That kind of bruise festers and the bitterness comes out.
On album 4, it's all about brotherhood. No irony intended.
There's only so much time you can spend working together because it's like you're not only working, we used to live in a flat together. And if you did that for 24 hours for like 10 years, I think you would get sick of each other.
In April of 1986, New Order once again prepared to make a new album. But the atmosphere was different from the harmonious high point of Low Life. Something felt off. And right from the very start. Stephen Morris.
Brotherhood was kind of like a bit of a nomadic record for us. And I can't remember that there were that many ideas actually written when we went in the studio.
The band would usually head into the studio armed with an arsenal of new songs. But not this time.
What we'd done is when we'd recorded Low Life, we'd basically used essentially the same equipment that we'd used to make Power Corruption and Lies. And as soon as we finished Low Life, this thing called MIDI happened, and it was kind of like, this is the future of music.
MIDI was a revolutionary new technology, a completely new way of linking electronic instruments and computers together. The possibilities were endless.
We were keen to expand our technological armoury, let's call it that, or to waste money. Basically, as soon as we finished Low Life, we got all this spanking new MIDI gear with not too much idea of how it would actually work.
In the time between the two albums, the band had to program all their new kit to play the old songs. Between that and the constant touring, there hadn't been much time to actually write new material. That meant they headed into recording with something of a blank slate and diverging opinions on how they should fill it.
We got fed up of each other on Brotherhood, and the split started to appear between the rock dinosaur side, as they viewed it, and their electronic, forward-looking, futuristic thing that, I mean, you can ask them. I've never really talked to them about it, to be honest. We've never really talked about why there was such an awful atmosphere on Brotherhood, but there was.
They might not have talked about it, but there was one thing playing on everyone's mind at the time.
Rob had been unwell and he wasn't really around, and so kind of like Brotherhood was a bit of an uneasy time.
Rob Gretton had always been there at the band's side, forcing them to push forwards, even when there seemed to be no clear path. He'd done it at the band's very inception.
Because at the time, Barney really didn't want to be the singer. Then they got somebody new completely on guitar and keyboards, and it's like I think if we were on our own, we would have said, oh, let's just pack it in because it's not working. But he sort of gave you the confidence to carry on. Having somebody like him, it just held us all together. And we used to have these meetings where, when you were doing an album, if somebody was upset, we used to have a meeting and say, come on, what's up? Then when you haven't got that, it's just like you're all sat there moaning in different corners.
Recording engineer Mike Johnson.
It's a bit like the Beatles falling apart when Epstein died, you know. Their dad was gone, you know, and they were a little bit lost.
But as ever, progress was the priority. Whether they had enough songs to fill it or not, the album would be recorded. Sessions began at Jam Studios in London before the band moved to Ireland to lay down the bulk of the record.
That was done in Wimmer Lane in Ireland, in Dublin. That was a nice experience because we were staying in a country house that we'd rented out by the Hellfire Club on the hills outside Dublin. So it was quite rural. And I remember we used to burn peat on the fire and, you know, the smell was really nice.
An idyllic setting for a recording that was, by all accounts, quite turbulent. The disagreements began early, and with one of the few songs the band had actually written.
They started with Bizarre Love Triangle, about the style. Does the bass have to be on this record? What's the point of having a group if you're not going to use the members in it that play? I still don't understand it. But, that's what happens, isn't it? It's like a family. And you can pick your friends, but you can't pick your family.
For the members of the band most enthusiastic about all the shiny new gear they'd acquired, Brotherhood was an opportunity to explore the new frontiers of technology. Stephen Morris.
We kind of learned how to make all this stuff work. And you could do an awful lot more with it, given the time. And so the stuff that we wanted to do with it was more sophisticated. If you listen to the difference between Blue Monday's kind of pretty crude, and then when you get to The Perfect Kiss, that was as far as you could push the gear that we had at the time. And then when you get onto Bizarre Love Triangle, we've got all this stuff and you could do really complicated orchestrations with it. It was great.
But the thing with the synthesizers is they dictated a certain way of working, one that wasn't necessarily communal in the way things had once been.
When you're doing synth stuff, it's inherently boring for the rest of the band because you sat there programming a computer with a mouse, and you can't have 4 or 5 people holding the mouse. So, I understand it, it's boring for the rest of the band. I remember writing Bizarre Love Triangle feeling a bit resented. Rather than going, yeah, it's a great song, great, let's add it to the pot, I got, what are you doing, taking over the show?
I think Barney wanted his own way, that was all. He, I think, wanted to just be indulged. From what I could gather, he wanted the group to be electronic. He was getting away from the jamming aspect of the way that we wrote. I presume he was loving the sound, he was loving the programming aspect of it. And I think that, even his opinion of it is that when you're writing with keyboards and sequencers, it is a very selfish thing to do and everybody else is sat there bored shitless while you're doing it. So I think he felt the boredom, if you like, in the room and he didn't like it. I sort of understand it now. I didn't understand it then because it was alien to how we'd been working.
Mike Johnson had been working with the band for years at this point, and he did notice a shift on this record.
Bernard did tend to, as time went on, become less willing to compromise with the others. He would want to write all the lyrics himself. It used to be a bit of a committee before that. He'd usually come up with a verse or two and then they'd all sit around, including Rob Gretton, and finish it off if he was stuck. But because Bernard became much more proficient at A, songwriting and B, producing, he tended to try and take the lead a lot of the time. And some of the others, especially Hooky, sort of pushed back against that a little bit.
That tug of war between tradition and progress would ultimately define Brotherhood.
He wanted to explore the electronic aspect of everything that he was doing. And, you know, having a drummer and a bass player sat there waiting to jam, can you put your guitar on, mate? I think it became irksome for him. And then when he got his own way on half the LP, if you like, he decided that it'd be a brilliant idea to split the LP into two, acoustic rocky and then keyboard, which in a funny way certainly made the split public and exacerbated the problem.
But for Bernard, the solution of dividing the album in two halves just seemed natural.
I'm not one of these good old days people. I'm interested in the present and future. I'm not really interested in the past. But the good thing about those days was that we were making music for vinyl. You had a specific time limit. So what most bands would do would put 4 tracks on one side, 4 tracks on the other side. And since we were making electronic music and band music, it seemed logical to put the electronic music on one side and the band music on the other.
For the journalist Paul Morley, that decision made perfect sense.
I always felt that New Order didn't make albums in that sense. It was very difficult to put your finger on, but they were like suites, you know, song cycles almost. That sounded daft saying that when effectively they were a pop group or a rock group or whatever the genre was, but they were song cycles, sometimes over one side of an album, sometimes in groups of 2 or 3. It was a very funny period where New Order were making these unbelievably gorgeous singles and then albums, and yet they were neither one or the other. They weren't a conventionally obvious singles group. They weren't a conventionally obvious albums group.
For Stephen, the question was never as straightforward as guitar and drums or electronic instruments.
Where it works is where the two things coexist. I mean, it's not like you've got to be this or you've got to be that. You can do both, or you can do one sometimes and you can do one the other. It's only when people get awkward, I like it when we rock, I like it when we dance. And that's just bollocks.
And what about Gillian? Did she ever feel caught up in this tension between the two camps?
Only when I was given a complicated guitar part to play, like State of the Nation, but I did it all. And when you look back, I think that was one of the appeals for New Order, because there was actually a girl playing guitar. And so I felt quite proud of myself because I could play anything. You know, I used to practice for hours in the practice room, but anything Barley came up with, I could play. So I thought, that's not bad.
My brother said that he was dead. I saw his face and shook my head. Can you see where we can be? We're losing our blood in the sick. Cause it's the state of the nation. That's only our salvation. Yes, it's the state.
Laetitia Sadier of Stereolab sees New Order's affection for synths as an extension of their punk spirits, not a contradiction.
What was new about New Order? Well, I'm not an expert, so I'm not a historian, but there was an integration of pop music, this very specific type of pop music which did not conform. So, of course, they came from that, punk after punk, which was very about cultivating your singularity. And of course, there was the electronic aspect, which later on would become quite a banality. But I think at the time, I can't really think of many groups who were doing that and who did it as successfully as New Order at the time. And it was pretty revolutionary.
And if you ask Christine of Christine and the Queens, he'll tell you that the friction between the digital and the human is what makes a band like New Order so compelling. No matter how enamoured they were with the synths, there was always something alive about their sound, something that begged to be brought to life and played by actual humans.
It's muscle music, it's flesh music. I don't know, I think they were just very incarnated in the simplicity of it. Even in the textures of the sounds, it just calls for incarnation. I think that's great. That's what probably we should do as artists as well, which is a kind of resistance against the digitalization of everything. They're very good at just talking about flesh.
As best as Stephen can recall, that partitioning of Brotherhood's two distinct sides came about as a natural result of their time in the studio. The rock tracks just came first.
Most of the rocky ones were the ones that were finished as it is and when it was. Broken Promises were done. I think it was Way of Life. The trouble with the sequence ones is they were evolving as we figured out how to work this stuff. And because you go, oh, let's do this and do this, do this. And it was kind of like layers and layers and layers and layers and layers. I don't have very fond memories of Brotherhood. It was kind of like lots and lots and lots of ideas that didn't necessarily fit together terribly well, but we kept them on anyway because that was the best thing to do rather than upset anybody.
But for Meg and Louise of the band Desire, there's something magical about hearing a band push at the borders of their sound.
I think like all of the sequencers, all of the synthesizers that they used, imagine at the time that they were discovering these instruments and playing with them and, you know, messing around in the studio. This was pre-YouTube. This is pre the internet. You have to figure it out on your own, and you don't know if you're doing something good or something bad. You're gonna put it out and you're gonna see what happens, you know? And so, yeah, I have so much respect for them. It's incredible.
Andrew O'Hagan.
That's what's so good about New Order, is that they always sounded like they were learning. They always sounded like they just bought new kit. They sounded like they were experimenting and twiddling the knobs.
Brotherhood ended up being partially defined by that electronic experimentation. But that didn't leave a great deal of time for lyric writing.
We ended up finishing it off in Amazon Studios, it was called then, in Liverpool, where friends Echo and the Bunnymen were in the other studio. I can remember Mac being amazed at us writing lyrics by committee out of desperation. Word that rhymes with June. Moon. You fucking write lyrics.
Will Sargent of Echo and the Bunnymen.
Barney came in and said, anyone got any lyrics? It's like, what? It just seemed like they weren't really that arsed about the lyrics. Like Mac's serious about his lyrics, you know. He loves the wordiness of it and all the rest of it. But Barney seems like anyone got any lyrics. Like, we didn't take him serious, you know. If I had took him serious, I'd have probably thrown him a few.
Perhaps most off the hoof of all, album closer, Every Little Counts.
It's basically every little counts when I am with you, right? I think you're a pig. I think you're a pig. Right, you should be in a zoo. You should be in a zoo. And that was basically how it got written. It was like cut-ups without the intelligible lines in the first place to cut up.
Which goes some way to explain Bernard's laughter halfway through singing it.
In a zoo. I guess I should have known I'd end up on my own.
Yeah. Because it was like, what the fuck is this shit I'm supposed to sing? Yeah. And you keep it in because it was sort of like light-hearted. That's the other thing. People tend to take New Order a bit too seriously, and it's nice to do stuff that is sticking two fingers up at that.
Hearing that laughter on Every Little Counts, it's hard to really believe you're listening to a band who are sick to death of each other.
We couldn't stand each other. And then we were laughing like drains as we'd write piss-poor lyrics to pass off as art.
So it wasn't all acrimony. Not all of the time, anyway. But when it came time to mix the album at Amazon Studios in Liverpool, the infighting resumed. Mike Johnson.
Hooky and I stayed in a B&B quite close to the studio, just round the corner, whereas the other three went home each night or each morning. So Hooky and I would have breakfast and go down to the studio and start work and get a mix-up, because Hooky was ever present in the control room throughout everything I ever worked with him. You know, he was sat on my left almost the whole way through every record. So we were there mixing it, and then hours and hours and hours and hours later, Stephen and Gillian had turned up, and then hours and hours later, Bernard had come in, and he'd want to start again. You know, all the work we'd done, we were knackered. We'd got a mix almost finished, and he wanted to start again. And then he had this great idea. Why don't he work through the night with me and the rest of them work through the day with me? I said, what? Where am I going to sleep then?
Brotherhood represented a change for New Order. It was the first time the band weren't all on the same page since the very beginning. And that was something they'd taken for granted before.
Up until Brotherhood, things had gone quite well. We didn't have a producer, really, on those albums, and they did really well. When we did Brotherhood, in my opinion, it got to the point where there was too many overdubs being done, and it got layered and thicker and thicker. And in a band, you've got politics where if you disagree with someone, that someone gets annoyed, and then it creates a bad vibe for a day or two. So it creates difficulties with band politics. So nothing was said about the overdubs because you just couldn't deal with the fallout, you know. So I think maybe after Brotherhood, maybe, I could be wrong, but maybe we got a producer in then, and the producer acted as a referee. We probably needed one at that stage.
When Brotherhood was finished, the task fell, as usual, to Peter Saville to gather together the scattered ideas and the fractured atmosphere, to package it all up and send it out into the world as a unified product. After the artistic reset of Low Life, he was still feeling the allure of simplicity.
I was dealing with nothingness and still trying to find a way out of nothingness.
But there was one idea he was drawn to.
The one artist who was a kind of spiritual route map for me at the time was the French conceptual artist Yves Klein, who had made works in the 60s from gold leaf and from water and rain and the wind. And Klein was conjuring, in a way, out of the elements themselves. And I was looking at Klein and, in a way, wanting to find a contemporary response to Yves Klein.
Funnily enough, Peter Saville's not the only one to have made the link. Christine of Christine and the Queens can't listen to New Order without thinking of Klein.
I think when I listen to New Order, I have a very vivid impression that they reinvented blue. And I'm not just saying that because one of the songs is called Blue Monday, but like I literally have Klein blue in my head when I listen to them.
For Peter Saville, it was Klein's work with gold that came to mind. And so he sent his best friend and frequent collaborator, Trevor Key, on a mission to a builder's yard.
And came back with two phenomenal sheets of construction metal that were incredibly inexpensive. They were for sort of cladding lofts and things like that. And one was called Aluchrome, which had this very beautiful spectrum polarization in it. So it sort of went blue and green and red and yellow, depending on how you looked at it. And this striated, quite malleable material called Titan zinc. And they were beautiful. And I said, Trevor, let's photograph these. And he said, shall I clean them up? And I said, no, don't clean them up. Let's just use them as they are. So I see them now as like my everyday Yves Klein monochromes. And the Titan zinc became the cover of Brotherhood, and the Aluchrome became the single State of the Nation, and then a slightly distorted version of it for Bizarre Love Triangle.
Brotherhood's cover is indeed a close-up shot of that sheet of metal, though it could be TV static or heavy rain illuminated by an overhead street lamp. It's an enigmatic image, mesmerising. The artwork has become another iconic piece in the Peter Saville New Order continuum, a text to be pored over by those who know, like the late great fashion designer, architect and visual artist Virgil Abloh.
Brotherhood, to me, is one of my all-time favorite album cover artworks. Just, the purity of it and what we had in common in our first conversation, I distinctly remember, is we're inherently sort of in this unfortunate position to take an artist's work and sort of give it an image, give it that link between a whole world sort of understanding and feeling, like the sonics on an album. It's a very difficult spot to be in time after time. How do you categorize all the emotions of an album or into a sleeve design? And there's an overwhelming sense where there's so much content on an album that the design needs to be equally as layered and impactful. And that's where things get noisy. But both in his practice and mine, the purity of this Brotherhood album. On one level, it's something mundane. It's something that's nothing. But there's a lot of layer and depth into it. So that was impactful to me.
For all the friction during its recording, the music on Brotherhood arrived as an uncomplicated whole.
None of the split that there apparently was that obvious as such. I mean, I think even then you would have been surprised to have found out the real difference of opinion within the group, because all those things were fairly muted in the sense of their public display. We know these stories now. We've had them told again and again from different positions and different points of view. And it seems obvious now, oh yes, that's the album where the split in the group between, lead bass guitar spoiling these beautifully imagined songs by Bernard Sumner becomes apparent. But at the time, it didn't really feel like that. It felt like that marvel of another New Order record, and almost a sweet, naive sense.
In the hands of the fans, Brotherhood has blossomed over the years. Let's not forget, this album gave those fans one of the band's most cherished songs. Gillian Gilbert.
You only have to play the opening bars and everybody goes bananas. Yeah. So, you know, it was something special when we wrote it.
Andrew O'Hagan.
The signal moment for me was Bizarre Love Triangle. I mean, just the way that opens up that song, the way it kind of throws itself at you, you're just like, oh my God, these guys are sort of unafraid to just break the whole thing open. It sounded monumental in a way that was very different from the way that Joy Division had or early New Order. I mean, there's something monumental about Blue Monday, but Bizarre Love Triangle just felt incredibly beautiful and slick and a bit like you wanted your mind to be.
Legendary DJ and electronic producer Crystal Clear.
Bizarre Love Triangle is just an anthem. There's a performance they did at Glastonbury on YouTube, and it's really extended. Like, they really extend it out, and it gives me goosebumps every time I see it, man. Like, the synth playing on that's just mind-blowing.
Alexis Taylor of the band Hot Chip.
When my wife and I got married, it wasn't the first dance, but Bizarre Love Triangle was the second track. I realised the irony in a song called Bizarre Love Triangle and getting married. But it's always been a real favourite of mine and Kerry's, and I think it's an incredibly modern sounding, futuristic sounding record, which is probably within my top 3 songs of anyone's music. It gets me every time I ever hear it.
Megan Louise.
I mean, that's honestly why we covered Bizarre Love Triangle. We wanted to find a song that was universal, that everyone could connect to. We just wanted to celebrate the music, celebrate New Order, just be like, let's have a fucking fun moment. At first, we only did it live, so we put it right in the middle of our set and that everyone flips.
Desire's cover, A Bizarre Love Triangle, became a staple of their live set.
We played it worldwide. We did 55 dates in 2019, and that's when we did it for those dates. And it was just wow, everybody sings. Tell everyone before the show starts, you better sing along, and I look at people in the eyes and everyone sings the words and just the smiles and the joy and everyone starts dancing.
Eventually, Megan and her husband, Johnny Jewel, put the cover down on tape and discovered new dimensions to this song.
By popular demand, we recorded it and released it on Valentine's Day 2020, which was really fun. It was actually really hard to record the song because doing it live is one thing, but then putting it into the studio, I was like, oh my gosh. A fun fact, Johnny was just like, don't be shy, you're fine, just get naked. I got fully naked and I recorded the song fully nude. Sometimes it works, just so you're a little bit less self-aware, I guess, very vulnerable.
Listen closely and you'll hear the spirit of Rob Gretton alive and well in the recording. He too was prone to stripping starkers and dancing on the mixing desk. With a little distance, Brotherhood has earned its stripes as another New Order classic. Sure, there were disputes about the right path to take, but then again, hadn't New Order always been pulling in different directions? Paul Morley.
In New Order, there were 4 very different personalities that had a very different view almost of what New Order was that ended up making New Order. And it's part of the mystery of how it works. I remember occasionally talking to people who might have worked with them in a studio. You could see that they had absolutely no idea how it happened, how a song was written. It seemed to be very much of the electronic era, the sampling era eventually as well. The way that you put together a piece of music and what seems to be a very technical, scientific thing, a pop song with certain beats it must hit and certain moments it must achieve and a chorus and this and that. And yet New Order sort of almost came into it in a ghostly manner to achieve these heightened pieces of sensation.
Tom Rowlands.
The real thing that I think is key to them is the strength of the individual voices in the band. All the fusing of these different sort of things and each individual voice being so recognisable on the record. It's insane, really. They get it all to fit in to these songs, Every single person in that band has a voice that would carry a whole other band, but you've got these strong identities. Then you almost look forward to... It's a weird thing, isn't it? You look forward to the appearance of a member in the band.
Andrew O'Hagan.
I was a great fan of Peter Hook's bass god element. We all were. He was the kind of permission giver. The way he played bass, low slung, unforgiving, unrelenting, unapologetic bass goddery happening with him. And so we were always really in favour of him. I was more a fan of his than I think of any individual in the band. But it's sort of pointless separating it. They were a band. They did it together. And you can apportion credit in whatever way you like, who was really the driving force or who was the more talented. I think the thing about bands is that there's this haphazard coming together of brilliance. They wouldn't necessarily be brilliant individually. They wouldn't necessarily click with other musicians, but it's part of the happenstance of pop, is that they happened to be together. And it created a kind of oil on water kind of weirdness. It's the weirdness that's always interested me.
That oil on water weirdness seeps into every moment of Brotherhood. The sound may be divided, but all of it's unmistakably New Order. Even Peter Hook, who was so frustrated by the direction they were taking at the time, has warmed to the record as the years have gone by.
Even Brotherhood's a great record. And I came to play it this time. And I remember the atmosphere was awful because of the divide, stylistic divide that we developed in the group. Yet when I came to play it, I thought, fuck me, I love these synth songs. I love them more than anything. Even more than the acoustic side. I was like, oh, you twat, okay.
Sometimes it's only when you look back that you can see the full picture. And looking back had never really been part of New Order's MO.
I mean, it was a ridiculous notion of New Order greatest hits. I think that's an oxymoron, actually.
But given the right conditions, even ridiculous notions start to look appealing.
Tony Wilson came to me and said, we need to release a greatest hits package in America to pay the inland revenue bills that we have. And I said, that's understandable and fantastic, Tony, but they've never had a great hit in America.
Just go in and write a hit single. Okay.
Next time on Transmission. Pressures mount, and the whole factory just might crumble beneath them. Unless New Order can save the day once again. Transmissions, the definitive story of Joy Division and New Order, is a Cup and Nuzzle production. It's presented by me, Elizabeth Olker. Our series producer is Frank Palmer.
I used to think that the day would never come. I'd see the light in the shade of the morning sun. My morning sun is a drug that brings me near to the child that I lost, replaced by fear. I used to think that the day
If you've enjoyed this episode, please give us a rating or review wherever you listen to your podcasts.